Okay, the recording is started, and Scott, take it away.
Great.
Oh,
Thank you for
well,
the
sorry,
intro.
one more thing. Scott did ask, I want me to let you know that along with the recording, a PDF of this session will also be made available with all of the links and the information that's in there. So you don't have to necessarily take notes as you go along. Thanks, Scott. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you for that. And as you'll see in the presentation today, I'll have a lot of links embedded because this is not only a session that you can learn from, it's a session that you can reference in the future and share with your staff and colleagues. So again, Suji gave a nice introduction, but um, welcome to the Microsoft Azure Users Group New York City. My name is Scott Haglund, and I am a principal cloud solution architect with Microsoft. I've been with the organization 5 years, and as CSAs or cloud solution architects we have different specializations, and I focus on the infrastructure and application side of the house. I also work extensively with some of our largest customers in the planning and executing of large scale migrations from on premises to Azure as well. So I'm pleased that the Azure user group is back post COVID, presenting topics that can assist you in improving your knowledge and skills on Azure. So really great to have everyone back. So in today's session, we'll be covering Azure Monitor and logging and sharing some of our best practices and recommendations that will be helpful as you move forward along your monitoring journey in Azure. And it's important that to share, I mean, in general, a lot of the things we're going to be going over today can be used in your hybrid environment as well, meaning you can use the same tools in Azure that you're going to be hearing about today in monitoring, that you can also monitor your hybrid or your on-premises environment and even other clouds. So that's an important thing to know. Just remember that the tools we'll be talking about will be your ability to centrally monitor all those workloads from a single place. I hope you're going to find this session useful and find some techniques that you can improve your monitoring strategy. And it's really important that we understand that getting to the cloud is just one part of the equation, the migration part, but really operating efficiently, learning how to monitor effectively and understand those workloads for planning, whether it be capacity planning or just understanding, if I have any security issues, any bad guys trying to get into my environment through identity, or just understanding if virtual machines are running out of capacity. That's what monitoring is about, making sure that you're successful day two. Day one is getting you in Azure. Day two is making sure your effective monitoring strategy is there that you can be successful going forward. So unless anyone has any initial questions, I'd like to get started with today's presentation. So what I would like everyone to walk away with today is these four things. If you can learn how to plan and design your monitoring strategy and understand what that architecture would look like, how to enable a monitoring and operational capability that you can scale over time, not just monitor a group of VMs, but monitor multiple VMs, multiple clouds, multiple regions. How to effectively move from a monitoring to an observability, and that's a little bit more to explain. I have some slides coming up to explain that, and how to communicate that. It's important that you can have alerting in all of this, but if you're not alerting the right people, it really doesn't help you to really drive into the situation when you have these problems or potential problems, whether they could be proactive or reactive. It's making sure that you have a really good communication strategy. So my goal here is to make sure that you understand each one of these pretty crisp. And I want to kind of talk about Azure Monitor, which is the real pinnacle of what makes all of this happen behind the scenes. So what can you do with Azure Monitor? You can do a lot, obviously, but I will tell you, every product that we develop, every product we continue to upgrade, the first thing it must integrate is with Azure Monitor. So if today is Build, a very, very significant conference that we have at Microsoft every year, where we make many new product announcements, well, you can guarantee that every one of those new announcements will integrate with monitoring. And that could be any product, whether it be from SQL Server, a new version of SQL Server, or to ability to gather Azure Arc, we're monitoring Kubernetes clusters and multi-clouds. It will all integrate into Azure Monitor. So a little kind of overview of what are some of the things, and this is just a scrape of the top of what you can do with Azure Monitor. So Application Insights provides that guidance to help troubleshoot and give you that root cause analysis quickly so you can drill down and find out what those problems are. You get the ability to analyze the performance and health of your Windows and Linux VMs and identify interconnected dependencies, which is often the most important thing. And even if you're monitoring performance and applications or dependencies on host VMs, it could even be on an on-premises or another cloud provider, as I spoke about before. So remember, Azure Monitor has great width and depth that you can do and monitor your workloads. Azure Monitor logs are based on Azure Data Explorer. So you can write queries in our language called KQL, which stands for Custom Query Language. And this is a language that's really easy to read and author, and you should be able to start writing some queries with basic guidance. I mean, 4-line queries could go through 100 million records in seconds, and I didn't say that incorrectly. Seconds to read hundreds of millions of records. It's our underlining tool that you can use, free to use. And we also have AI Ops, and a lot of people go, what are AI Ops? It stands for the artificial intelligence for IT operations. And it combines the big data and the machine learning to automate IT operations, processes, event correlation, anomaly detection. And I'm going to give you a little bit more about AI Ops because it's a really important topic a little later in the presentation. And then you get the ability to use log analytic dashboards to visualize all that saved log queries or use workbooks to query data from multiple sources within Azure. As an example, analyzing the performance logs of a virtual machine to identify like a high CPU. That's a really straightforward, easy thing to do. But showing that built on panels or showing and displaying those results as a grid in an interactive report. Those things are all built in Azure Monitor. So what does it look like and how does it work? It all starts with collecting telemetry. So Azure Monitor can collect data from applications, networks, any type of infrastructure. You can even ingest your own custom data. So if you wanted to track your own logs, you can write them in our log analytics database if you have some customized code. And all that data would be stored centrally in a managed logs and metric stores. And that's a real key feature here. What are logs and metrics? So all data collected by Azure Monitor fits in one of the two fundamental types, metrics and logs. So metrics are the numerical values that describe some aspect of a system at a particular point in time. So they're super lightweight and real near time. I would say real time, but I'll say near real time. They could be like milliseconds. So I guess it would be real time, would have to be instantaneous. So near real time. But then there's logs. Logs contain data organized into records. So with a whole bunch of different sets of properties for each type. So telemetry events and traces are stored in logs, for example, as well as performance data so that it can be all combined for analysis. So think of it this way. You start with insights for resources such as your applications, your containers, your virtual machines, your network, and then you provide that guidance to help drill down and troubleshoot to root cause analysis quickly. So you may, in certain cases, just want to visualize the data. Maybe you're not troubleshooting. You just want to see what's the health of my systems. How am I doing? It's a peak Thursday. I have this major campaign I'm launching, or it's a really big retail day. You can provide all that information through Azure dashboards, even Power BI integrations, and you'll get more of a native experience if you use a function called workbooks. So after visualizing that data, you may want to use Metrics Explorer and a powerful big data analytic tool called just generally log analytics, we call it. And that's capable of querying. I talked about hundreds of millions of records. You can query petabytes of data within seconds. And if you want to be proactive and take corrective actions, you can use and create alerts and run books. And if you tag an alert with an action, you can actually be proactive and take corrective actions even before the alert is, you can log the alert and then actually take care of it. So if this is something that's always happening on a Wednesday and you don't want to be woken up at 3 in the morning, you can actually put corrective actions in place. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you really have to have a low touch or a high touch environment. But you have that ability through alerts to do auto remediation. And then just remember that monitoring isn't done in silos. Azure Monitor provides a lot of out-of-the-box integration with popular ITSM tools. So if your environment uses ServiceNow for change or configuration management example, you can use those APIs with things like event hubs and logic apps to build custom integrations as well. So I kind of wanted to give the basic foundation of what Azure Monitor is, so we can now start to talk about what those best practices would be. So I like to think of monitoring as a journey. And when you think about monitoring, it's helpful to split your monitoring lifecycle into 6 distinct classes. And there are specific best practices associated with each of these phases. So initially, and most importantly, as with anything before you start building an application or building a schema for a database, you always have to have a strategy. You have to understand what should be monitored, and most importantly, who needs to be notified in case there are issues. So not only is it important to know that the blah, blah, blah file is having issues, but what business aspect of your organization does that affect? Who do I need to alert? We also have to think about architecting your log analytics workspace for an enterprise readiness level, not just a silo, but thinking about how this integrates with all of your other applications, and designing it with data security in mind. And no doubt security will want to know what those logs look like and possibly tie into them with some reporting. So think of it always having a component of data security as part of your strategy. Then you want to enable that data collection by configuring those resources to collect those platform log and metrics. Deploying Azure Monitor agents, for example, and collecting data from hybrid VMs. So that's how you do it. If you had these on-premise virtual machines running in a VMware environment, how do you pull that data back into Azure Monitor? Well, we have these Azure Monitor agents called AMAs that will sit, you can download, and that will send that data up into Azure and feed that into your collective. So then you can actually see what your hybrid environment on premises or even other cloud workloads. Say you had a workload running as a virtual machine in AWS. That same agent would send over that information into Azure Monitor. So you have that single pane of glass. Then you have really configuring those actionable alerts we talked about on all your service level agreements. And you may not have SLAs with your business, or you may, but you can tie that into and show those thresholds and say how you're performing. Even it's really great to say, hey, look, onto the business, I have 100% SLA, or I have a 98% SLA, and this is it. You can actually use those alerts to actually help drive that reporting capability. And sometimes the business doesn't know how well you're working. This is a great way to advertise just how much you're monitoring the environment and how many metrics and analytics you're going through to make sure those systems are up and running. And this is where the monitoring to observability. So this is where you transition from monitoring known issues to full observability. So you're starting to correlate your logs across applications and infrastructure for insight into your entire system. So when that database is down, I know that application A and application B is affected because it's a shared database. Now you're starting to look correlation. So now you're starting to understand components that may affect others, i.e. dependencies, that you can now start to see more of an enterprise view as opposed to an individual silo view. And then this is where you focus on implementing a dashboard solution like an Azure dashboard. Really easy to do, built in the product, and it's native. So that's your dashboarding platform from Azure. It's also great for an Azure Arc environment. And Azure Arc is another type of monitoring capability that you can pull centralized monitoring agents into a single screen where you can actually monitor a Kubernetes cluster running in an AWS or a Kubernetes cluster running on-prem and actually have control over it. You can monitor desired state. You can monitor drift. You can do all sorts of things with Azure Monitor. So that's really event correlated into an Azure Arc environment. So I want to drill down a little bit more now how to best configure these solutions now in more detail. Now that we understand the 6 specific distinct classes. And this is where I'm going to start to share a lot of different links because I got to take a moment here and talk about the Cloud Adoption Framework. It's probably some of the best work that Microsoft has ever done. And I say that from going through a lot of documentation every day. It's really a guide that is broken into 6 stages. The CAF framework has so many references. It has so many labs. It has so many deployment capabilities that are built right into Azure that you can launch Git and actually execute code whether it's developing or executing an ARM template or a bicep. All those capabilities are built into the CAF documentation. Tremendous documentation. I wouldn't want to try and explain it because it's so self-explanatory, but I will say there's another 6 areas that goes into with the CAF framework, which is strategy. You have to start by understanding your business objectives and how to identify Azure can support them. You can plan, which is where you start to align your people, process, and technology to map out your cloud adoption plan. Ready, which is where you prepare your environment using the Azure Setup Guide, right in the CAP documentation, and get ready to deploy a landing zone, which is a pre-built, software-defined data center by code. Really, it builds all the networking components, the subscriptions, the resource groups. It puts the appropriate guardrails around your environment. It puts in network security groups to make sure that certain ports are turned off that you wouldn't have open for just SSH coming into your virtual machines and having that level of vulnerability. It puts in all that good hygiene into your environment based on Microsoft's best practices. Then you get the adoption side, which is the split out in 2 parts. You got the migrate and the innovate. So you simply migrate your on-premises environment to the cloud. That's a lot of people just call that lift and shift capability. Or you can choose to innovate and take advantage of the cloud native capabilities to modernize your applications. And you have 2 left. You have govern, which is create those benchmarks and implement the governance, and an MVP to measure progress so you know how you're doing against the scale, and manage, monitoring your environment through data collection and alerts, which is exactly what we'll be talking about today. So I do want to drill down into each one of these areas in greater detail. So planning the monitoring strategy, this is where you really have to be very careful. You start by including the monitoring service owner, like the manager of operations, as an example, and anyone related to the personnel for that planning phase. So you would continue engaging them throughout that whole development of the strategy. The focus will be like to develop a monitoring configuration that's based on like, what is the composition of the service? These are the things that we always want to know. Are those dependencies monitored today? What are you doing on premise today? Are you just going to carry that thought over to the cloud? If so, are there multiple tools involved? Is there an opportunity to consolidate without introducing any risks? What's the SLA of the service? How can I measure it? How can I report on it? What should the service dashboard look like when an incident is raised? Who would be the service owner for each one of those functions? Maybe I start with a service owner for the entire application, but maybe I get more granular over time. Johnny and Susie know the pricing side. Susie knows the inventory. Maybe I want to make sure that they get alerted when things happen. And is there a team that supports the service? What kind of metrics does the resource produce that I can monitor? Maybe there's things that you have to put in your application to create custom metrics. Application, you're going to be sending how many tickets I send to the warehouse for distribution, and you can put a custom metric in there. And then when that metric drops to a certain number, you can fire off an alert. Do I need to monitor both an on-premise component and an Azure workload in a single solution? So there's a lot of questions. You just don't go right into a monitoring strategy and say, okay, I want to monitor the CPU and storage, and then I'm good on my virtual machines. No, there's a lot more to it. You really want to think about that strategy and how you're going to answer those questions. What's the criteria for alerting? That's going to determine how you're going to use the monitoring platform. If you're migrating from an existing monitoring solution, use the migration as an opportunity to reevaluate those signals you collect. Maybe you've been sending an email to a service owner that has left the organization a year ago. That happens a lot. Or maybe you're sending emails when things break to somebody that just hits delete in their inbox, or they're not monitoring, or they left that function. How do you keep that fresh? How do you keep that data actionable? That's really what that strategy is. Now, a lot of companies, when they're migrating over from Azure, have been using SCOM, like System Center Operations Manager. You can also connect SCOM as a management group to Azure Monitor to collect those data, that same data, and put that right in the Azure Monitor log. So our products, the Microsoft products, all integrate, and we have third-party API integration as well. Things like ServiceNow, like I talked about before. So Azure Management Packs is also another handy way that you can send Azure Monitor alerts from a core service to SCOM and vice versa. So you have that ability to send things back even to on-premise if you want to alert those on-premise systems that may be there for 3, 6 months, or a year as you're finishing a migration strategy. So there's a lot of integration and planning just on how you're going to integrate that existing monitoring strategy that you have on premise, or how are you going to enhance the Azure monitoring strategy that you already have. That planning is never stopping. It's always a continual thing that you'll be doing. Next is, you got to design your monitoring architecture. And this sounds like, oh, this is really easy. Well, it can be if you set up the required number of log analytic workspaces up front. Try and use as few workspaces as possible. Every application should not have its own workspace. That's going to get really expensive because you can pay by workspace and keep data longer than you really need. So the idea is, unless there's a specific organizational requirement or geographic data sovereignty constraint, don't create an individual workspace. Data sovereignty, where I have data in Germany and all that information needs to stay within Germany. Well, the workspace needs to stay in Germany as well. That would be a perfect example of why you'd have an individual workspace. But try and use workspaces across application workloads. Variable data retention can be used also. Sometimes you need data for a longer time frame, like security and audit logs. But other times, as far as an application log, 30 days would be more than sufficient, maybe 60. Um, Central teams can have access to all that logs with direct workspace access. So while individual teams might just need resource access, you can now start to say, I will have that security group be able to go into my data logs for 90 days, and then I can put a roles-based strategy around that. So they can only read where some of the application folks can read and update. So you have RBAC that's implemented directly into log analytics. So you don't, security can only read. Say if you have auditors, they can read that data as well when they come in. RBAC sits right above all these workspaces. So don't think, well, if security comes in, I have to create a separate workspace for them. Oh, I'm doing an audit. Let me do a separate. No, you can do it all through RBAC. You don't have to, bifurcate the entire workspace's strategy. Try again to keep it together unless you have specific needs, like I talked about before, like data sovereignty or a special application with PCI level 3 that has to have its own log data that you, for some known reason. Decide whether you want to use a separate or single applications insight resource for your scenarios, meaning separate resources can help save costs. So it also prevents data mix-up. So and allows more direct access. So if a single resource can help keep all that relevant telemetry in one place to use with application insight, do it. Different independent applications like can use separate I-keys for each app. Our recommendation is to use a key vault per application per environment. So if it's development or pre-production or production for that fact per region, this helps you not to share secrets across environments and regions. It will also help reduce the threat in case you run into a breach. And
Scott, sorry, if you don't
question.
mind, we have a couple of questions popped up in the chat. Is now a good time? Can I ask them now, or would you prefer them later?
Why don't we ask them now? Because if it's relevant to the slide, I want to move off it.
Okay, yeah, it sparked a little bit of discussion around the workspace comment that you made. And one question that came up was about the relationship between App Insights and Log Analytic workspaces. How do App Insights are they associated with the workspace, or are they on them by themselves?
So App Insights can be associated with a workspace, and you would want to, depending upon the type of App Insights you're using, you may, and that's really what I was going into. If you need to share all that relevant telemetry in one place with application insights, make sure that when you're using the independent applications, use separate I-keys for each app. So if you're dealing with a lot of different key vaults per application, as an example, sometimes we do that because my key vault would be very different for production as it would be for development. It would be a good idea to separate those by independent applications only when you need to. But I would still group the development together. I would still group the productions together and any pre-prods. But I wouldn't go down any fine granularity beyond that. I think that over time, unless you have some specific use case, over time, I think that should be more than sufficient. You don't want to mix up the environment too much.
Okay, great. And then, so assuming you have, let's say, 3 environments, and let's say you wind up with 3 workspaces, you decide to create 3 distinct workspaces for those environments. I think Chris had a question. If there's going to be a lot of applications that are writing to that same workspace, is there any possibility of having collisions of data while writing into the same workspace? And also, how do you ensure that when you do a query, that you are querying information from the correct environment? Or are the queries tied to a workspace, or can you have queries that go across workspaces?
Yeah, these are all great questions. So queries in KQL are very specific to subscription, workspace, application, and any tag things that you put into them. So if you want some custom tagging, you can do that as well and query on that. As far as collision in the database, you're not going to have that because it's all our big data component. And we're really talking about petabytes of petabytes within seconds being taken advantage of here. So I've never had anyone have a situation where they were having sort of performance data running log analytics. Not my experience. Does that make sense?
Great, thanks. Yep, it does. And Chris, please post a follow-up question if that did not. Okay, he said he's good. Thanks,
Okay.
Todd. You can
Yeah,
continue.
and there's one more thing on here. And it's finally, you need to decide the network configurations to monitor those firewalled internet resources. So firewall exceptions, proxy redirects, as an example, or log analytics gateway can be used to monitor intranet services. So that's, you have all this capability. I do want to talk about how Azure Monitor is now enabled you to create a new subscription and use those activity logs and platform metrics that are automatically collected. So you're going to create that diagnostic setting to collect more detailed information about the operation of that Azure resource and add the monitoring solutions and insights to provide that additional analysis on the collected data. So that Azure diagnostic extension is for Azure virtual machines, and it collects the data to Azure monitoring metrics. So even Azure Storage or even Event Hubs as an example. So that log analytics agent is for virtual machines in Azure and other cloud environments or the on-premises environment. That dependency agent requires the log analytics agent and collected process sits there and collects that detail, but also monitor those dependencies as well. That's where the dependencies feature comes from, that actual agent. You also, it's important to mention that the codeless attached. So it's easiest to enable the runtime monitoring with no advanced configuration. So auto, there's actually a setting called auto, which collects the same dependency signals out of the box as SDKs, for example. And then if you want to evaluate the need for any custom instrumentation or data collection, understand the out of the box and on by default data collection already available for Azure resources. A lot of our functions have this ability built in. A lot of people don't turn them on, but some are on by default and some you have to physically turn on. Make sure that you're implementing a feature, find out what is out of the box and what's on by default. Also configure those agents and diagnostic settings for additional logs and performance counters if you need them. And consider manually instrumenting any apps with custom telemetry data to gain, those valuable logs. So your distributed traces or usage insights, as an example. All of that is able to be integrated with Azure Monitor. So cost optimization, you can really reduce the frequency of data collection and only collect what is required. Now, you can go crazy with logs. You can actually create custom logs. You can log every event. You could actually spend a lot of money because there's a good part to understand about logs, and I really should talk about the costing here for a second. You get, with log analytics, you do get 31 days of free monitoring, and there are different tiers that we have. And that's our legacy free tiers that we call them. And that's, again, it's limited in some cases where you only get per day 500 megabytes. But it's great to start learning what I can and what I can't monitor. We also have legacy standalone per gigabyte tiers. So you can keep up to 2 years of data there, but then you pay per gigabyte charge. And we also have a bunch of other tiers, but it's important to know that within 30 days, you get a real good introduction of what log analytics can bring with you, both on the platform and metric logs. So you can start to like touch into these capabilities without spending any money. Start using KQL, start doing some queries and start to query the environment, see what's possible. Start with an application, and then you can think about, well, what would it be for an enterprise? As you start to introduce more and more applications into your monitoring strategy, set up appropriate data caps. You can set up caps in each one of those, so that way you don't run into bill shock or somebody's calling you in the office, the CFO, saying, why are we spending so much money on logging? I don't understand. You can use sampling to reduce the number of telemetry items that are actually sent from your apps. You can set lower retention on the selected data types, and that can be used to reduce your data costs. So extremely long retention cycles can also cause a billing shock. You don't need to keep application telemetry data for 2 years, 2 months, maybe. But if you're tracking maybe a bug situation and you're really looking into something that only happens at a month-end situation, maybe 3 months. But then you got to remember to turn that down. Log retention cycles can default, and when people move up and say, well, this is a security requirement for 7 years, well, if you start keeping all logs for that kind of retention, the billing is going to really run up. Leverage reserve capacity pricing when it's appropriate for lower cost. So this is interesting. A lot of people don't know this. Since 2019, capacity reservations pricing model has been put in for log analytics. So with this model, you pay a fixed fee based on the capacity tier that you select for the data ingestion. So it's the capacity tiers start at 100 gigabytes per day and provide discounts of up to 25%. It's like when you do is the pay-as-you-go virtual machine and reserve pricing for 1 to 3 years. You can do that also with the log analytics workspace, but that's after you become more mature and start to understand, well, I'm running at 50 gigs a month. Now let me start to pre-purchase that and take advantage of Microsoft discounting. Also evaluate recommendations from Azure Advisor. Azure Advisor is always running. It's one of those things that a lot of people don't spend enough time with. It's going out there and it really focuses on 4 areas. It focuses on availability. Is this application set up for high availability in case it fails? It's security. What is happening? We got some bad ports that are open on this. Performance. This thing is running at 5% every month. Why do you have such a large machine? And cost. Let's go out there and take that machine that's running at 5% and take it down to from a 12-core machine down to a 4-core machine and run it at 60%. All those things and evaluations are running all the time from Azure Advisor, and you can plug into those. And some of those alerts are push button where you can actually fix the problem. Some are a little bit more involved where it says, hey, look, this machine, like I gave you the example, is only running at 5%. Why are you running such a large machine paying as you go? You could actually resize that machine, which would require a reboot. But that would be something where an NSG would be an example where, hey, this port, let's just give port 445 for some sort of file transfer that you don't want to have happen should not be open. You can actually block that. So you can actually, in the actual Azure Advisor, hit the button and it will actually block that port through the NSG. So, and finally, consider archiving those logs in Azure Storage for longer cold retention. So if you do have that long time query requirement, put it in colder storage, put it from there in log analytics, and use querying on the archive data. Now, it's going to take slower. It's going to be much slower when you run that query on archive table, on like archive data, but it's a fair trade-off than retaining Azure Monitor logs on a higher level of storage for multiple years. That'd be way too expensive. Operationalizing and alerting the sides and really focusing on workflow. So this is where you configure only the actionable alerts and don't spam. Set up alerts on all those service level incidents with thresholds. So configured based on those SLAs that we figured out from our strategy when we first got into this. Use metric alerts for better performance and faster latency. Use log alerts for more powerful query-based triggers. Properly define those severity descriptions and avoid sending blanket notifications to people that cannot take an action or don't care that they're receiving those or moved into another function. You're still sending them emails and SMS messages. Set up those multi-resource metric alerts that they can grow flexible with your resources. Put a strategy in place that is scalable over time. Set up those highly customized alert management pieces with ITSM or your ticketing systems like ServiceNow. Integrate as much as you can. Make it relevant for the customer. Set up automation runbooks, custom workflows. Use logic apps and use that auto healing capability and remediations. You can take action on these alerts. You don't have to bubble it up to someone to say, we have to close this port when you could have done it on your own. Create scheduled queries via things like logic apps to run custom alerts on schedule. Once a month, I'm going to be checking my environment. You can use that. You do your audit and remediation just to prepare for events like that. You can also set up auto scaling to manage elastic resources like a VM scale set or app services. So utilizing the built-in host metrics, guest VM metrics like Azure Diagnostics or app level metrics, all can be done with Azure Monitor. And if you think about it, you can use the capability or create the same kind of capabilities that we have under the covers for VM scale sets. Like if a certain performance of a machine is over 70%, add another machine into the scale set. Well, you can now monitor those on a schedule. Take a look at the runtime metric, and you could add your own CPU, or you could move it into a larger machine with greater memory, or you have that same capability through logic apps and event hubs to do the very same things that we do under the covers with your own logic. So just don't think that you're just limited to the things that we do. You can actually do this on your own through your monitoring strategy. This is where traditional monitoring approaches can fall short if a system or an application doesn't adequately externalize its state. Meaning, to reach observability, you need to correlate many different sources from logs and metrics and traces. And this becomes even more critical and complex on distributed systems, especially if you're using containers or microservices, serverless. That really gets to be a challenge. So a monitoring system should address really the two questions. And if you have a really good answer to these two, you're in the right path. What is broken and why? So what is broken is about what, and I should say the symptom, while why is about the cause. A good understanding of the distinctions of what and why enables you to get an effective monitor and distributed system, and knowing where it allows you to watch and understand your system state using those predefined set of metrics, because you're monitoring these systems and you know when you can detect failures. So you also know what your baseline is. So this information is crucial for analyzing long-term trends. So if you're building those dashboards for alerting, you can use that data and understand that application's behavior, detect problems. Just because you're not keeping the log analytics doesn't mean that you can't continually write these dashboards. You can go back a week, a month, a year, and start to see, hey, look, on the third Wednesday of every month, I have this situation happen. You can start to track that. You want to spend time focusing on that AI ops we talked about, that machine learning topic on the slide we talked about before. That's where we created, Microsoft has been doing this for our own products. We created a team a few years ago at Microsoft to collaborate across all the Azure engineering teams, partner with Microsoft Research to develop AI solutions to make cloud service management more efficient and reliable. So AI Ops is transforming our cloud business, Microsoft's cloud business, by improving our service quality and customer experience at scale. So we're driving continuous cost optimization and ultimately improving the reliability, performance, security, because we see AI Ops providing value in the three areas: higher service quality and efficiency, higher DevOps productivity, and more of a customer satisfaction in the end. So basically, you're going to see much more Azure out-of-the-box functionality across all of our services using AI Ops. This is where we're focusing a lot of our development dollars. And you'll continue to see investments in that area. Communicating and collaborating. Well, if you want to set up an effective communication protocol that collaborates with your teams, you really need to decide what level of data access your team needs across the organization. The best way to do that is try and stay as native as you can. It's really Azure's role-based access controls. We talked about that a little bit before, about having security, having only read access. And Azure Monitor provides two specific roles for monitoring. And you get this right out of the box. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to create any RBAC. You got a monitoring reader and a monitoring contributor. And that only grants access to monitoring data while restricting any other access to any other resources. So there are additional roles that you can provide that restrict access even further, like to sensitive data, such as like if you were doing a debug snapshot or a code level data collected from exceptions of failures. Maybe you don't want to have other teams have access to that data. You can even restrict that a little bit further. But if you want to set up further collaboration, like as part of your DevOps or SRE tools and processes, you can use Logic Apps. Azure Logic Apps will give you that ability to set up those custom workflows. So an example here would be if you're using, let's say, DevOps or your GitHub or Jira to do your bug management on a work item. You can create bugs tracking automatically whenever an alert gets triggered. This is where you start to do your own AI ops here. You're using Azure DevOps to produce your CI/CD pipelines, so you can use those alerts to effectively add quality gates to your pre-production and production environment. You could even halt a production deployment. Can be halted if a particular KPI is not met or an alert is triggered. For your developers, all that production telemetry can even be accessed in an IDE in the Visual Studio. So you don't necessarily have to lead the development environment if you want to do debugging or diagnostics or even do any type of root cause analysis. So in terms of visualization, you have a bunch of options. Depending upon your specific needs, there are different visualization platforms that are available. So if you want to create a situation dashboard, we have an Azure Portal dashboards. If you've ever worked on the portal, you just say save the dashboard. You'll see it's very easy to do. If you want something a little bit more operationally focused, Grafana is a native integration we support that's super effective. And then you can go with Azure Monitor workbooks. So they're very powerful and highly customizable. And you can use those to create any type of interactive report. So make your own troubleshooting guides or end-to-end analytics or health dashboards. And finally, if you want higher business level dashboards, you always have the ability to get data in Power BI. And you can export all of this data that we talked about in querying to a Power BI to create any of those reports. So that you always have that available to you. So those were the 6 areas, a little bit more drilled down to. This was a little bit more of a review, but I want to summarize the things that you really have to think about. You have to have a plan. You really have to understand what you're going to monitor, why, and what those things look like when they break. Who do I need to inform? What are those SLAs? What systems are they associated with? You want to understand what should be monitored. You want to understand who should be notified. Understand how those resources are organized. You don't want to configure this stuff manually. Automation is key. Anything that you can automate when a system goes live and put these metrics and monitoring and alerts in place, try and do it through automation. Trying to do this in scale with hundreds, if not thousands of applications, it's almost unmanageable. You want to think about, you're not monitoring everything here. You just want to monitor the things that need to be actionable. You don't want to send tons of email and spam to people that may or may not be able to take action. You want to make sure that you don't take exactly what's on-prem that may or may not be working. Usually it's not been cared for and fed well because monitoring systems go in really well in the beginning and sometimes lack the care and feeding over time. Don't just copy what you're doing on-prem. Really take a fresh look at what you've been doing on-prem and see how you can create those extensions into Azure and do it better by asking these questions with the strategy and use our native tools. You want to continually improve this. This is not one of those things where you just define the dashboard and it's done. You're going to define a dashboard for each of those service components. You're going to use metrics to help guide the diagnostics and identify resolutions and workarounds if a root cause is uncovered. You want to use dashboards to drill down those capabilities and further customize those views. You're constantly improving this. You're going to be looking at logs and for deeper diagnostics. So with metrics, you can help target search criteria and improve metrics even for the next incident. So I found that I've been monitoring this, but I just uncovered that, and I didn't even know we deployed that function. You just continually adding to your monitoring strategy. It's never done. It's always continually improving. If you could stick with those, I think you'd be on the right strategy. Now, this was a lot of the detail that I wanted to go through today, but I want to leave you with a bunch of links. These are, we're continuing to improve Azure Monitor, obviously, since it's the pinnacle of all of our strategy of knowing what's happening in Azure. These are just the things that have happened over the past 6 months, and you can look at these because they will be in the PDF, and you can look at those links. But I also have some really useful resources. And I want to share with you, and a lot of people don't know this, we have a tremendous amount of learning labs that you can do through Azure Learn. And you can take a particular learning path. Now, what I did today is I have the learning path for Azure Monitor, and I want to show you how easy it is to start. Oh, and we also have one for KQL as well. But let me just show you what the Azure learning path looks like. When you go down and you look at Azure Monitor, you get into 5 hours and 31 minutes of education. But what we do is we say no one's going to be able to sit down and dedicate 5 hours and 31 minutes. So we break it into digestible chunks and we break them into modules. So you can say, we do an introduction into Azure Monitor. A lot of the things that we covered today, how it works, things that, what is it, what can you use Azure Monitor for? And then you get into, these are the other components, defining a holistic monitoring strategy. This was number one on my hit parade. These are the things that you really have to focus on. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? Who am I doing it for? Now you get into the health of those systems. How am I going to be capturing that data? It starts with a virtual machine and you're capturing the metrics, those near-time numerical values. Within milliseconds, you're getting a good idea of what's going on in the environment. Then you also start to say, now I got some analytics that are coming from application insights. Now I'm going to start to look at page view times. So you start to build now onto that strategy. Now you're starting to monitor the performance. How do I look holistically on that virtual machine? And I'm going to do it by Custo, that KQL language. And then finally, you get two things. You get your analyzing your logs, and you get your incident response by adding those alerts. So what happens is you start to build your strategy and understanding of Azure more and more as you go through the different modules. So this is just for Azure Monitor. We have every one of the products, whether it be SQL Server, whether it be 2019 managed services, whether it's anything in regards to Azure Arc, or some of the other things that I mentioned today in this call. All of that information is available in that learning path. You just got to pop it in, and you actually find, I very rarely do I find nothing on a product unless it's like came out today and build. Where our announcements are. You got to give us like 30 days before we start to develop some of that doc. You'll have the intro doc, you'll have the initial guidelines, but you may not have some cookbooks. And best practices cookbooks is really what that link is on top. This really gives you a good idea of what a strategy looks like, what those best practices would be kind of in practice that we talked about today. So kind of pulls the whole picture together for you. These links, of course, will be in the PDF. That's what I had today, and maybe since I can't see the chat, and I apologize because I had the presentation, if anyone has any questions, we have a couple of minutes left, so I'd be happy to answer those.
Scott, as a developer, what should we do to enable this process that you talked about, just to enable the whole logging journey?
Well, the good news is the logging journey is already enabled. All of our products are logging. What you need to do initially is to create that first log analytics workspace. And if you were starting to figure out what could be my monitoring strategy, you start to think about your application, you start to think about what should I monitor, who should I alert, and really start to think about the SLAs and what do I do as far as, over time, does this spread into other applications? And then I would start to take a free tier. I would take the free tier, take the one that you get 500 megs a month, or I think it might be 500 megs a week. Let me check here. I think I have a link for that. Yeah, it's 500 megs per day. So that's a lot of logging that you can do. I would start to say, take a look, if you want to start with application insights, start putting some monitoring agents on, put that data in your log analytics workspace, use KQL to start querying it, use Azure workbooks, use the portal to create dashboards, and start to expose the capabilities that you have within Azure Monitor. As you become more mature and you start to think about, I'm thinking about an enterprise monitoring strategy, you start to move up in a higher tier, and you start to think about, well, maybe I need potentially a gigabyte plus more a month, and you can move up the tier. You can use those same queries, those same dashboards, and you start to create more agents. So it really starts small and grow it over time. Use all the freeware first. Make sure that you really understand what you want to do. Start with an application and grow it over time. That makes sense?
Awesome. Thank you. Yes, it does. And I don't see any more questions in the chat. So there was a request to get the content over here, and I have mentioned that we will be putting the PDF and the recording. We'll attach it to the session on the Meetup website. So Scott, I'll appreciate if I can get that from you after the session.
You will get that immediately.
Thank you. Well, Scott, thank you so much for the session today. This was a really nice summary of all the best practices for logging in Azure, which I think is a key fundamental service and capability all of us need if we are moving to the cloud. And I thank you for sharing that with all of us today. And for the rest of the audience over here, if you liked this session or you would like to see similar sessions, or sessions on other topics, please feel free to message us on the Meetup site and let us know what kind of sessions you would like to see. And we'll find other CSAs like Scott who have their own expertise maybe to come in and talk to you on a variety of topics. So feel free to ping us and let us know what's on your mind. We are planning another meetup next month. We do have some potential speakers lined up, and we'll get that shared shortly. Thank you.
Sujit, and just to add to that,
Nico, go ahead.
we're thinking in doing it in a hybrid mode. So hopefully we're going to be able to book a room at the Microsoft offices in New York, in one of the Microsoft buildings in New York, probably at the Times Square office. So any of you interested in meeting us in person and get to know us, and so we can build a community, you're more than welcome. So more information will be shared in the Meetup group. So stay tuned.
That's really great. Thanks for reminding me about that, Nico. Yes, we're looking forward to get back to in-person meeting, but of course we'll do it hybrid because not everybody is able to meet in person just yet. And we certainly want to be able to meet more people, and especially folks who work or live around the New York area and can benefit from these sessions. Great.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.